Juniors. Today we're going to talk about the civil rights movement and what it looked like for females. Women during this time, again, 1950s, 60s, 70s, um, they had been discriminated against, oppressed in a variety of forms, workplace, especially as it pertained to things like wages and that sort of thing, educational opportunities, and ultimately having their own civil rights movement. So that's what we'll discuss here this morning. So in the 1960s, there was a growing popularity in the belief of feminism, and feminism was the belief held by many people, especially women, that women should have rights that were equal to men, whether it were economic, political, social, that women should have some of those equal rights. So whether it pertained to acquiring work, at a wage that was similar to that as of a man's, or having the same political representation, and like similar social, expectations as males. Feminism was kind of that belief and that platform of trying to level the playing field between women and males, men. So, and that was something that grew, a belief that grew in the 1960s, and it was something that when women joined the civil rights movement, because women actively participated in this, especially on the behalf of African Americans. Oftentimes, some of the more so the larger civil rights organizations that were maybe representing African Americans at the time, just say for example, women were oftentimes given like lesser roles, and when they talked about maybe having like bringing attention to their own civil rights movement, oftentimes they were kind of brushed aside by some of these other civil rights organizations, basically being told that their issue was not as important as others. And so really in the 1960s, that's kind of when women will organize and bring attention to some of the civil rights issues that they were facing as well. So in the workplace, by the 1960s, more and more females had started participating in the workplace or had acquired employment. By the end of the 1960s, it was like 40% of our workforce was females. So you saw a growing participation in the workplace. And that was something, historically that had always been a concern of employers, is that, women have children, that takes them out of work. So with some of the medical advancements and things in like birth control, that was something that women, were able to use to ultimately determine, when they would have children, and something that they, could use to, I guess, broaden their participation in the workplace. So that's something else we saw in the 1960s. The Kennedy administration in 1963 is going to pass something called the Equal Pay Act, which was kind of a big deal at the time. And that was something that basically said that employers were to pay the same salary for the same work, regardless if the employee was male or female. And now there's still a lot of debate and discussion over that today in a wage gap between women and men, if employers are actually following some of these different federal laws saying that employers have to pay women and men the same for the same job. There's a lot of discrepancy in that, and a lot of political opinions on a wage gap that still exists today. As far as other items here to be aware of pertaining to this women's civil rights movement here, the women's movement of the 1960s and 70s. Eventually, in the 1960s, there's going to be a group of women that create what was referred to as NOW, and that was the National Organization for Women, and that was kind of a major civil rights organization representing the interests of women. They mostly focused it on the labor market and jobs being available for women, and some different things like educational opportunities, and those being, having those in place for women. So they were kind of the major organization representing the women's movement of the 1960s and 70s. In the early 70s, Congress passed a law. It was a part of the Higher Education Act. It was an amendment of that, called Title IX. And Title IX is something that is still very much a thing today. And it has to do with banning gender discrimination in different education and athletic opportunities. So as a result of Title IX, many colleges had to open up enrollment for females. Schools now had to also offer funding for female sports, okay, and similar funding to that as males, and so that kind of opens the door for more female participation, especially in educational and athletic opportunities. Also in the early 70s, the Supreme Court examined the issue of abortion, which I know is a pretty sensitive issue. So in 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that females had the right to obtain an abortion within the first 3 months of their pregnancy if they so chose. Um, and again, a lot of political and moral debate on this, but the um, a lot of the females that were a part of this women's movement saw this as a victory because it gave women that right to privacy to determine if and when they would have children. So that was something that was viewed by some as a gain, viewed by some as a loss based on moral grounds. Okay, we won't get too much more into that, but a very important thing for this time period, understanding the Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade. And then we also see in the early 1970s the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment. So the Equal Rights Amendment was a proposed constitutional amendment that gets passed by Congress. And again, the way the amendment process works is in order to add a new amendment to the Constitution, 2/3 of both houses of the Congress must pass it or ratify it. So Congress did their part. 2/3 of Congress, 2/3 of Congress approved of this. It then has to go to the states. 3/4 of all the U.S. states have to approve it in order for it to be added to the Constitution. 2/3 would be 38 states. By 1977, only 35 of the U.S. states had ratified it. So it did not become an amendment, and it was defeated. But what the Equal Rights Amendment would have done, it would have guaranteed men and women the same rights and protections under law. It was kind of, quote unquote, a matter of simple justice, as it's sometimes referred to. But that was defeated here in the 1970s. So again, just things to be aware of. Understanding that women were also a part of this civil rights movement.